I am Carolyn Jackson, and I've got the pleasure of chairing this seminar from sunny Lancaster, where I'm based. And I don't know what the weather's like where you all are, but I hope it's as sunny as here. So just before I introduce Gwenda, just a few notes about the seminar. So it's a delight to have you all here and to see so many people here, and just shows how interesting Gwenda's topic is. So the seminar is being recorded, and afterwards we plan to put it on the Educational Research YouTube channel. So that will be available afterwards as well. I'll briefly introduce Gwenda, and then she'll speak for around 45 minutes, which will leave us plenty of time for questions. So we'll have up to 45 minutes for questions after that. And you can put questions in the chat, or ideally, we'd encourage you to ask them if you're able to, but either way is fine. So that's the plan. So it's an absolute pleasure to have Gwenda here speaking to us today. I had the honour and pleasure of working with Gwenda while she was doing her PhD with us here at Lancaster on the HERE programme, which is one of many programmes that we offer from educational research. Gwenda's a senior lecturer in the Liverpool Business School at Liverpool John Moores. And she'll speak to you today about some of the work that she did for her PhD, which focuses on learner identities and the experience of undergraduate students. So without further ado, Gwenda, I'll hand over to you, and we're all looking forward to it. Just if I can ask everybody while Gwenda's speaking to turn off, most importantly, your microphones, but also your cameras as well. That would be great. Okay, you okay to get going, Gwenda?
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Let me share that. So hopefully you can now see my slides.
We can.
Let me just turn that down. Right. Okay. So firstly, thank you very much for asking me to come and give this seminar. It's great to kind of re-engage with my PhD work. I had my Viva last September, and it's been a busy academic year between then and now in terms of teaching load. So it's nice to be able to kind of step back from the teaching and revisit some of this work and think about it all over again, and think about perhaps how I've put some of what I've been talking to into practice in the last few months. So as Carolyn said, I teach at the Liverpool Business School. I've been there for a number of years, teaching undergraduate and postgraduate level. And so what I'm going to talk to you about today really is my PhD work, which really kind of comes from my own practice as a lecturer. So I'm going to talk around perception of good independent students. So students who are good students and independent in their learning. And specifically within the context of business students, I'll talk a bit about business students, a bit about how I went about my research, and then talk through the findings and some of the arguments and the discussions that come from that. So to start with, kind of at my starting point, where I started from really was this feeling that a good student learns independently and goes on to be successful. And in lots of ways, that's where my kind of initial thoughts and ideas of wanting to look at how students perceive their own learning came from, with the view really that independent learning was what they should be doing, what they should be aspiring to, that student success is what we all want. And, you know, on the face value of it, it's hard to argue against that. That's what we want, successful students. I'd heard talk of good students, and by implication, bad students, almost every day of my working career within HE. And good students were those that attended, that engaged, that perhaps went on work placements, that all of that kind of work that they did would ultimately lead to them being successful in their degree outcomes and more recently successful in terms of getting a good graduate level career and job out of it as well. So they were independent learners. They kind of mastered the vagaries of academic referencing. They didn't question that they need to go and read academic journal articles, that they kind of really lent into the kind of academic work that they needed to do. So good students, and that persona of a good student as being the basis of a lot of work that goes on with universities and working with students. It's also, of course, I can get my slides to move on, how we measure things. And that has definitely kind of increased over the last decade or so. But we measure against an ideal. We measure against what we think students should be doing in terms of how frequently they attend, engagement in terms of engagement with digital resources, engagement with the library, engagement in just logging on, and also entering buildings. We judge them against that kind of collection of data, and then around attainment. So what results are they getting? What is the end attainment levels? And then also after they've graduated, on employability, are they going into those graduate level jobs? So we increasingly use those metrics, those measurements, and it's a measurement against an ideal that we use. And those measurements are frequently, rather than looking at kind of what those good students are doing, it's frequently about spotting the bad students. We don't necessarily label them as that. We can talk about at-risk students. We can talk perhaps more recently about students who are struggling, and the language may have changed slightly around that, but it's still kind of, we're making judgments on what we think students should be doing and basing them on some kind of ideal. And then alongside that, there's this underlying ethos that university is around independent learning, and that independent learning is something that students should be aspiring to. It's what we should be aspiring to on their behalf, creating the right environment for them to become independent, giving them the skills to become independent. There is something that's really kind of very firmly embedded in what we do. I think it's also frequently thought of as being something that's unique to higher education, that it's something that differentiates us from other educational settings. It's something that is highlighted when we talk about transition, so transition from high school or college into university, and something that can be hugely problematic for our first year level 4 students. So I came at it very much from, yes, this was an issue for students, that they were struggling with these things, and that we needed to work harder at making it more kind of explicit for them in terms of what they should be doing, how they should be doing it, when they should be doing it, and all those things about reading, academic writing, time management. There's so many different things that come into independent learning. And one of the things I started coming up against when I started doing the reading around this is that there is no one consistent definition of independent learning. And it can be thought of as something that's very emancipatory. It's about academic freedom. It's about freedom to make choices to what to learn. Equally, it can be about study skills. It can be about how to learn. And very much there is still this strand of kind of learning to learn. Students need to learn how to learn, and there is something that they struggle with. Independent learning is also something that's very much written into the documentation, the procedures of higher education. So you will find a lot of it written into things like module proformas or program specifications. And it's around the fact that contact hours, so hours working with a lecturer in a classroom setting, whether that's online or face-to-face, is usually about 20% of a student's time. And the rest of it, the 80%, is that independent learning time, whatever that may mean. So it's used in that way as well. And statements, this is from Kent University, but statements like this can be found on almost all university websites. That independent learning is kind of everything. It's how you do your work, that you're not going to be absolutely told how to work all of the time, that it's crucial to your life, to your employment, to what goes on outside of university as well. It's kind of, it's really important. But when we think of that, and that's what we think students should be, what they should be aspiring to, what we generally find is that students are all a bit of a disappointment, that we all will talk around what we think of poor students, bad students, weak students, that they don't study enough, they don't read enough, they fall asleep in class, which, you know, has been known to happen in my classes, definitely, that students aren't somehow, even though that's what we aspire to, that's what we think they should be, this ideal, this good student, that they just aren't. And an awful lot of the research that goes on in this area is very much about how we can turn these poorer students into good students. So it's around shifting the students' work and what they're doing in terms of making them then successful. If only they can be independent learners, they will be successful. So these were my kind of starting points. And then alongside that, there was this general perception, both in the literature, in policy, in just general day-to-day talk within working within a business school, that somehow business students are the worst of this kind of bad kind of student. And you certainly see it in the literature, this portrayal of business students as being the most consumerist, that they're very careerist in their attitude, that they're, because of this, quite passive in terms of their learning, and their learning identities can be quite weak because they consider themselves as buying their degree, that they're in it for that graduate employment, for the job that they get at the end of it. Business schools themselves can come in for a hard press as well. So business schools are kind of often perceived as the cash cows of the university. They have so many students, as it says here, it's one of the biggest subject areas within the UK in terms of percentage of students studying in there. So for me, it was kind of based on my workplace experiences, but also based in this kind of perception of what business students were and how they were perceived and how they just didn't meet this kind of ideal. So that's where I started from. My kind of methodology theoretical framework was very much constructionist, interpretivist, qualitative. A lot of what's written around students and their learning is very much from the quantitative view, and it can be about measuring against an ideal. It can also be very much from an individual perspective. We look at individual students and we look at how they regulate their learning. We look at how they go about their learning against those kind of criteria for what being a good student is. So originally I was looking at things like Cinnamon, who proposes a theoretical framework of what's called self-regulated learning, alongside other ways of looking at independent learning as well. But, and I will kind of talk about this all the way through, what then came about was a change of direction, really, and to start looking at other ways of perceiving student learning that wasn't quite so individualistic. So things like LARV and Wenger, situated learning communities of practice, those kinds of theories started to be very useful in trying to think through some of the issues that I was grappling with. And I think this kind of realization that, as Wenger said, our institutions are largely based on the assumption that learning is an individual process, and beginning to question why that should be and whether there was a different way of doing things. So my research questions were then very much focused on looking at what the students perceived was their experience of learning and what learning meant to them. So rather than measuring them against something, I really just wanted to be able to capture some of their thinking, some of the how and the why things, rather than measuring against something. So it kind of all linked together in terms of that I wanted to ask about what they thought made a good learner, what did good learning mean to them, what value they gave to independent learning, what they thought of as success, how they measured the success of that learning, and whether their affiliation, their kind of identities of business students had any kind of impact on that. I very much stressed to them that there was no right or wrong answers, that I wasn't looking for them to kind of tell me what they thought I wanted to hear. I just wanted to hear their actual views and their ideas on these things. So the research setting was my workplace. So it was a business school. It's a post-1992 university. And we don't get many international students, so it's quite a home-based university in terms of student intake. I looked at undergraduate students only, and I did semi-structured interviews. So I held 19 in total, 17 were during COVID, which I can talk about afterwards if we've got questions around that. I used a thematic analysis when I was looking and working with the data. There are, of course, limitations. It's a very small sample and it's within a particular context. So I'm not looking to prove anything. I'm not looking to claim anything as kind of being substantive as such. What I wanted to do was seek answers to questions and to provoke a debate that can perhaps spark a wider debate and a wider look at things that we should perhaps be researching or talking about. The other things in terms of limitations, but I think is also a strength in some ways, is that the students who I did recruit to interview were all self-declared as high achieving. Now, to start with, I wanted to kind of look at a spectrum of students, those who weren't perhaps achieving so well. But I think what I then managed to capture is actually, we don't often look at how good learners learn. We don't often study good learning. And I think it's Larve that says that as well, that how those good students, good in terms of successful, in terms of outcomes, we don't often look at what learning means to them. Instead, we usually try and look at how those students who perhaps aren't doing so well, how we can make them better. So it was a different set of students that I've captured. So on to the things that I then found or started working with. So one was those 19 students that I talked about presented as being enthusiastic, motivated, and generally very happy with their university experience. It was quite in contrast to the dominant image of the undergraduate students, who are often portrayed as being dissatisfied, who are kind of unmotivated, who are uninterested, but these presented as being generally happy. There was only one complaint, and I'll come back to that further on. So they generally talked about that they picked business studies because they were interested in the subject area. It wasn't necessarily that future employment was top of their list. It was that interest. Some talked about a passion for the subject area in itself. They wanted to learn more about the actual discipline and subject of business, business management. This kind of enjoyment in what they were doing, this interest, it's often underlooked, I think, overlooked, sorry, in terms of how we talk about it, both kind of in policy and practice and in the literature. So we tend to see frequently this kind of, you know, that there isn't that much of a scholarly interest from business students, that they are that kind of career-driven, career-focused. But that didn't come across really in this. If they were talking about future employment, it was very much about giving back or around carving out a different kind of future for themselves from where they'd started from. So it was quite a fresh intake in some ways in terms of what they were saying. The other thing that came across, and it was only 19 students, but what I found within those 19 students is there was very little commonality. I think one of the students, Jack, said to me that he thought, my view will be kind of like unique because I'm not your regular student. But what I found was that every student's views were unique because none of them were regular students. And one of the reasons why I wanted to kind of study different levels of students across slightly different business programs, and not look at specifically kind of first in family or specifically those that had come from an international background. I wanted to look at kind of a cohort of students, because in lots of ways this is the cohort that I walk into when I'm teaching. So these students all there in that room together, when there's very little commonality in terms of their background, can be really interesting then to think about how you approach that as a cohort of students that you're actually working with. So quite often the research looks at segments, and I tried not to do that, and I think captured that in terms of what these students were talking about. In their kind of, there was some that had come from clearing, some that had started a university course, dropped out, reapplied, come somewhere different. There was lots and lots of different things going on for each of those students that made them quite different from each other. The other thing that I captured was, through these 19 students, there was a really strong sense of personal, individual responsibility for their learning. They felt responsible. So I asked them who was responsible for their learning, and only 3 of the participants said that lecturers shared some responsibility for their learning. The rest of them thought it was all down to them. I didn't explicitly ask them about fees. I purposely left it out, but a large number of them talked about fees as being a sense of personal investment, or that it made them personally responsible for their learning and for how they were as a student. Often the literature, the research looks at students as thinking that they're buying a degree, that it turns them into some kind of consumer view, that they're paying for it. But what these students were actually saying to me was that because they were taking on loans and they were paying for it, it made them feel that they were personally responsible for their own learning, that it was up to them. And that was such a strong sense that ran through everything that they said, really, through what they were saying to me, that they felt personally responsible for their own learning. And I'll come back to some of the implications of that in a bit. When I asked them what they thought was a good learner, what made a good learner, and what they thought about themselves as learners, what came through there is that they could easily identify what they thought was a bad learner, and they used the term a bad learner, so that they could see what a bad learner was. And as Ruby said there, like people that don't have an idea or don't have a pen. And those 2 things were really interesting, because the idea alluded to the thinking part of learning, that learning is around thinking, gaining knowledge, and thinking through the implications of that knowledge, and having an idea, having some kind of an opinion, formulating an opinion around that. But equally, the kind of study skills side of things, not prepared, not having a pen, not having a notebook, things like that came through as well. What also came through when they were talking about being a good learner was an interest and enjoyment in the subject again. So back to that, actually wanting to learn and wanting to know more about the subject that they'd chosen to enroll in. And I don't think we often talk about enjoyment of learning. It certainly, I don't think, comes up in the literature that much about students actually enjoying learning. But this is what these students were saying to me. They thought that a good student needed to want to learn, and also that being a good student was around being confident, and they generally reported that they were confident in their learning. They felt confident as learners, and that confidence was built on social interactions. It was around seeing what was happening around them in the classrooms or with fellow students. It was also sometimes based on results. So knowing that they could be successful in terms of passing a module, and that passing a module actually made them feel more that they belonged at university. And I think that was a really interesting thing that came out as well. I think it's Picton that writes around success forming a foundation for a sense of belonging. And it's a really interesting way to view how success in learning increases a sense of belonging, that what comes first, that kind of being at a university or feeling you belong because you're actually getting some grades and passing things. So what they were talking about in terms of a good learner was quite individualistic. It was around gaining confidence. It was around being confident. It was around having a willingness to learn. What came through strongly as well was that attendance not being, that attendance was around being seen to be a good learner rather than being a good learner. So being seen and being heard, being able to ask questions. But attendance absolutely wasn't viewed as being necessary. They thought that they didn't necessarily have to attend. It wasn't that important to them. But it was all around finding your own way. And I've put a quote there by Maisie. I just thought I was just a rubbish learner, but it's all about finding your own way. And this very much made me think around that you've got the photo there of the path of how we think students should learn and how they should be at university. But frequently, what we all do when we come across paths like this is that we find our own way. And that's what these students were saying. So when I asked them about being a good learner, none of them necessarily mentioned things like study skills or independent learning or how they learn. What they talked about was the feelings, the confidence, the interest in the subject area. But it was all quite individualistic to them. So when I did go and taught them around independent learning, what came up there was that for them, independent learning was generally expected. They expected more independent learning at university. And for them, what that meant was learning on your own. That's what they said, that they kind of how they would define what independent learning was. They mentioned things like locations. So sometimes independent learning is being done at home or in the university, so outside of the classroom. Reading was mentioned, looking for additional information was mentioned. But they had, like I said, all expected it. They knew there would be more independent learning. And this got me thinking around, so if they knew it, they expected it, in what ways was it then kind of problematic? But also, why was that thought of as being different at university to earlier educational settings? So what was it that made it that much kind of difference. And then I hunted around a bit and found that actually independent learning isn't unique to higher education. It's not something that's unique in terms of a transition from A-levels or college. And that if you look at things that are written around transitions between GCSE and A-level, and even transitions from primary school to high school, independent learning is there in terms of it's what makes it different. It's something that students have to learn, that children have to learn. So you've got the quote there from primary school to high school, that what makes it different is the greater emphasis on independent learning. So it's not unique to higher education, and the issues in terms of transition and independent learning aren't unique even. So that got me thinking around things like these, you know, these young adults that we teach at undergraduate level. They've been learning forever. We've all been learning forever, and learning is to some extent an individual process, but the setting is really important. So where they learn is different. And then that it's not unique to HE means that it's something that can be kind of questioned all the way through. Why do we talk about independent learning? What is it about independence that makes it kind of different? Or and some of those kind of ideas around problems with transition come from things like the National Audit Office 2002 was a report that brought in the word spoon-fed, that university students have been spoon-fed, and so university learning is somehow difficult for them because they just don't know how to learn on their own. But of course, students do know how to learn on their own because it's what we've always been doing, that kind of study time that's needed, that time spent away from classroom setting. So when I ask students about what they actually do in that kind of time, in that independent, free, private study time, whatever it is called, there was wildly different amounts of time that they spent actually studying. There was no indication that any of them met the recommended study hours, and that reading was problematic, that they either struggled with the reading, that they didn't know what to read. Some people just said it was just absolutely just a really big issue for them, that reading itself. And I asked them about critical thinking, and they really struggled to talk about what critical thinking was. But again, what came across, and these, like I say, are high achieving students, these are students that are doing well, is that what they thought was it was very much what they made of it, finding your own way again, that it didn't really matter how they went around it, as long as they were studying and that they were doing the work, that's what mattered. So no right or wrong way of doing it, just that they were doing it. And the study hours is an interesting one, because it's written into all our pro formas. Like I say, it's that kind of 20% classroom, 80% outside of class. But really, what is that 80% for? And we know a lot of students now use that time to actually work, that do paid work, because they need to. So independent learning hadn't been a surprise to them. It wasn't necessarily problematic to them, that they were expected to do it. What was a surprise, and what they hadn't expected, was the social aspects of learning. And I didn't explicitly ask them about social learning, but they all talked about it. So they talked about this all the way through. So IL is not a surprise. What was a surprise was group work. It was that they could work with friends, that they enjoyed being in the library, that learning was very much a collective activity for them, and that this was massively important, and that if anything, they gave more value to this than they did to the independent learning, which was perceived as learning on your own. So there was very marked differences there, and really interesting differences as to how we see student learning and how we view students should learn. So I've got a few of the quotes there around some of the things that they said around learning. So you can see they're learning in the library, having other people around you that are learning, talking to people. It wasn't just having a lunch, it was talking around the subject area while having lunch, and that this was really important to them. So this kind of led me back to the literature, and I began doing what I think Thompson refers to as reading against the grain, looking for things that kind of contradicted that independent learning as being what students should aspire to. And there is a body of literature that does question it. So Vassallo looked at self-regulated learning, and as it states there, that these concepts aren't neutral, they're not now value free, they're not a historical form of human engagement. It's something that, you know, we have kind of embedded within higher education as something that's to be valued, not necessarily questioned anywhere near as much as it could be or that it should be. And Leithwood there, and then Lava around independent, if you think of independent learning as focusing on that individual capacity, then it does create problems. So when I looked at success, again, it threw up really interesting propositions and interesting things that they said. I asked students how they thought lecturers measure their success, and I got a kind of, everyone said that lecturers measure student success in learning via grades, interestingly via attendance and engagement as well. But it was all around lecturers seeing it as numbers. So we've got Noah there saying they just go off whatever number comes up on their screens. There was a real feeling here of them knowing that they were in a mass education system, and they knew that they were one, we can have 300 students on a cohort of business study students. So they knew that it wasn't a personalised view, it wasn't individualised, that it was about grades, it was about metrics, it was about kind of hard numbers. But when I asked the students themselves how they measured the success of their learning, it was far more about emotion. Grades were important, and I'm not saying that they weren't, but what students talked about was what those grades meant to them. So it was far more subjective, it was far more effective in terms of the meanings that they gave to those grades and how they viewed success. A lot of this was from students who had previously failed, so hadn't done so well at A-levels, had come through the clearing system, had attempted a university course somewhere else and hadn't passed the first year. And it was around proving something to themselves. It was about proving something to others sometimes, and that was family members or even friends. It was about personal development, about growing up. It was about learning something and understanding something because of it. And I think we don't focus on this whatsoever, that these students were actually talking about enjoying having learned something and then having some kind of validation that they had learnt it, but also just that they could understand things that were going on. So you've got the quote there from Sam at the bottom, which was around being able to understand what's happening in the news because of something that they'd learnt. There was a real sense of hard work paying off, that they wanted to feel that they have achieved something through their learning as well. So success definitely wasn't purely about, it was about the meaning of the grade and what that meant to them personally. The other thing that came through really strongly all the way through was that they wanted to feel challenged. So they wanted to feel kind of intellectually challenged and they wanted the sense of satisfaction that came from that and achieving something through that challenge. It was the only complaint that was in the data. So you've got a quote there around level 4 students saying that she was looking back to her first year and she didn't learn anything new. So as she said, I paid £9,000 for nothing. And that was around not feeling that she'd learned anything in her first year. And like I say, that was the only complaint. And it's funny that, you know, we think of students as being those kind of consumers, but Hish was saying it's because I didn't actually learn much in that first year. And there can be all sorts of reasons for that. So students can previously have studied business at A level, but that sense of challenge came through really strongly throughout. And you've got the quote there from Eddie about learning in terms of becoming a better person, and it's kind of results of learning in terms of that were important to them. So there's all sorts of things here that you can tease out around critical thinking. So previously the students said to me they didn't know what critical thinking was, but here they were talking about challenge, being challenged to learn something new, thinking about how to apply it. So they could use their own terminology around it, but didn't give it our terminology of critical thinking. So on to some of the key arguments. So I would argue there's no such thing as a good students. They were also different in the way that they approached their learning and how they went about it, that it's hard to say that there's one good way of doing it. And these were, like I say, successful students. It's not that they were struggling with their learning particularly or struggling with what they were studying. There was just no way of going, okay, that's what makes one way of being a good student. The independent learning, that even though they come through as very individualistic in terms of, you know, their own motivations and things like that, that really that sense of kind of independent learning, they knew they had to study on their own. They knew that that's what learning was. What they talked about then was the enjoyment of learning within a kind of collective community, that it was that social aspects of learning that they really valued rather than learning in an independent way. That success for them was very multifaceted. It kind of gives a different view from what can usually be quite a hard metric driven way of measuring success. But that's how they thought we as lecturers were measuring success. We were using the hard numbers, we were using the grades, but for them success was something a lot more with very many more layers to it. So I think in terms of the independent learning bit, for me, I think the position I'm at the moment is we could just drop the independent. If we focus on learning rather than independent learning, it completely changes the focus, and it perhaps moves away from that. It's down to you, it's your kind of, it's up to you whether you're successful or not. That focus on the individual, it brings us back perhaps to them focusing far more on what we do as an academic community to support, to encourage, and to make kind of our bodies of knowledge more accessible. And there's loads of questions there around reading and what we're asking students to read, about things like referencing. It's all around the kind of things we put around our academic knowledge that can make it harder to access. So that if we start thinking of students as being independent in their learning and pushing them outwards, if we kind of try and pull them inwards more, then we get more of that social aspect of learning coming through, that kind of move away. So I just want to put these two ones from the top ones from Sheffield University, but again, you probably see this in all sorts of different university settings, those statements around what independent learning is. Now, in fairness to Sheffield, if you go further down on that page, they talk about independent learning not having to be learning on your own. But it's that kind of top level messages that learning at university is about learning on your own. As it says here, no one's going to hold your hand, no one's going to tell you what you need to do, no one's going to tell you how to do it. But then we're surprised when students don't attend, we're surprised when they don't necessarily engage in ways that we think they should engage. So I think there's really mixed messages in that independent learning message that is given out that isn't necessarily helpful or supportive. I think it can perhaps stop students from coming forward to ask for help, to ask questions, to talk within a classroom setting. And you've got a quote from one of my participants there that actually kind of absolves lecturers from all responsibility for learning. And I think those are the issues, and that creates real problems for us, that if what we're saying around you're on your own, you've got to go and do your learning, means that they then feel completely responsible, then where do we sit in that, and where does how we open up those bodies of knowledge sit as well? So lots of questions that come up there. And I'm not saying that students shouldn't study on their own. I'm not saying that they shouldn't be responsible for their own attendance. So I'm not kind of taking all that responsibility from them. What I'm saying is that really it should be a joint effort, that we shouldn't be pushing students away, that really we shouldn't be focusing on students as being the issue. We should be focusing more on our kind of understanding of how it says institutional systems and subject disciplines put barriers in the way of student learning. And that really if we start talking about community and welcoming students into that community, then it becomes more of a kind of, it's a joint venture rather than us passing students on to us passing knowledge on to students who then have to go on and deal with all of that knowledge on their own and make of it what they will. So it takes that focus away from the student being purely responsible for their own learning and brings it back to us and how we think through the intellectual challenge, the knowledge, the questioning of those knowledge bases. That's really important as well. So that's a whistle-stop tour really through my thesis, but of thinking really, like I say, of coming up with that disciplinary knowledge and challenge as being something that we should be focusing on, and perhaps less on the good students and the ideal student and the independent learner. So I'd really love to know what you all think. I'm sure there's lots of ideas, and I can see that there's some questions as well. So I shall stop sharing so I can see some of those things. Okay. Okay, so I think, yeah.
Gwenda,
hand up.
That was absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much.
Well,
I knew it would be, knowing your work so well and knowing you so well, but it's to hear you speak about it was just fascinating.
I know, as I go though, I always think, oh no, I want to talk more about that. I want to talk more of that. So
no, it's absolutely brilliant and a real pleasure to listen to you. So thank you. And there's lots of positive comments in the chat that you might have a look at, but also obviously people keen to ask questions. So,
yes, okay.
JB Morris, I think your hand was up first.
Hello.
Hi.
It was really interesting actually, and I'm really gladly surprised by the results of this research. I have a couple of questions. The first one is about this assumption that a good students learn independently and goes on to be successful, and more particularly the second part of the sentence. Didn't you come across a particular way of thinking where actually it does not really matter to be a good student, where learning is just a process to be successful, and successful meaning getting a good job? Because you mentioned that they had a strong sense of personal responsibility as fee-paying students. It's quite interesting. So didn't you come across some students or learners, maybe in continuous education, considering that paying fees meant buying a degree without an expectation that it should be a given actually to have the degree, and the learning does not matter.
I've certainly come across that in other research. Yeah, so I think that was, you know, that can be our understanding of what students are at the moment. But the participants that I talked to, that just wasn't the case whatsoever. They all felt that it was down to them. There's quite strong quotes in, you know, I'm paying for it, so it's all my responsibility. And yeah, so it just wasn't there in these interviews that I did. But like I say, it was only 19 students, and you know, I'm sure that there are some students who consider it in a different way, but I think it's just a fresh perspective, and we perhaps sometimes we get the answers we're looking for when we ask students about fees or about being consumers. And I think there can be a lot of, and policy even, you know, policy talks about how we advertise universities even at the moment is around, come to us and you will get a good job. But when you actually talk to 18, 19-year-olds, that getting a good job, yeah, it may be there in their background. You know, they've been probably told that since primary school, that they need to study hard to get a good job, but it's not necessarily why they're there.
Okay, very good. Can I ask a second question?
Yeah.
Yeah, you mentioned engagement at the beginning. Did you come across the topic of entertainment? Because it feels sometimes like we need to make it fun to entertain the students, to make them engaged.
Yeah, I mean, certainly I've come across those ideas before, and there's certainly ideas around, you know, yes, how lecturers should be making university education more fun. But I mean, I think one or two of my participants mentioned that they don't like boring lecturers, but I think there's a difference between being boring and being entertaining. You know, you don't have to be entertaining to be interesting. You can just have interesting ideas. Yes.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Yeah.
Great, thanks. Just to say, I asked everybody to turn their cameras off at the beginning, but feel free to turn them back on now if you'd like to. So Paul Ashwin, I think you're the next questioner.
Thanks. I guess it's more of a reflection than a question. But thanks, Gwenda. That was really, really thought-provoking, engaging, and fascinating. And I think what you did really nicely is you know, you kind of showed the nonsense of the whole language around independence. You know, the moment you say, well, independent from what? You know,
Yeah.
do we mean independent from peers? Do we mean independent from teachers? Do we mean independent from the course? We don't mean any of those things.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like, so what is independent? And I think in drawing in the stuff around knowledge, what that really does is to help to highlight that nonsense, because the whole reason for engaging with the body of knowledge is being disciplined by it. So it's not even about engagement, it's actually about a knowledge limit, you know, knowledge limiting how you see the world as well as informing it. And kind of the final reflection I give, and I think you're kind of, it's there in what you've said, but I'm not sure you said it explicitly, but apologies if I missed it, is that actually the problem for universities is the whole notion of independence reinforces consumerism. You know, the only way in which independent makes sense is if you're an independent consumer looking to take stuff and move on with it. So in fact, if we want to counter that, we in fact should completely drop the language of independence. And you know, what you show really nicely is that the students recognize that connection between consumerism and independence, even if we don't. So there's some reflections, you know, you know, yeah, thank you.
Yeah, no, I completely agree that it kind of struck me as I was doing this, that what we're saying to students is, you're independent it's up to you, it's your responsibility. And then we think, well, why aren't they turning up and coming into class? And it's, you know, we're telling them they're on their own, and then we're going, why aren't you here? Why aren't you coming in to talk to us or to listen to us? And there's a real big contradiction there, I think.
Thanks. I'm going to keep going with the questions that people have got their hands up for, and then come back to the chat a little bit in a minute. Joanne, I know you've got your hand up, but Jan signalled in the chat that she would like to ask a question but can't put her hand up. So Jan first.
Sorry, Joanne and Sunil. Oh, my two pals. Thanks. That was great, and I really hope that you are writing that up for publication, because it's something I would like to be able to refer to and integrate in my own work. The question I had was about what you were saying about how they valued their achievements and the sort of what the grades meant to them, and that it was about, you know, proving to themselves, proving to others. And this may go beyond what you were actually looking at, but was there any sense of how they regarded how much they trusted? Was it about particular grades that they trusted, or was it about just the overall sense of achievement? So was it about that they got a 68 and they thought, yeah, that shows I'm a certain sort of student? Or was it more just a general sense of, I'm really pleased I passed this, and that the teacher has acknowledged that I've engaged with this knowledge and learned something?
It was a bit of both. So there was certainly, you know, there was a bit in there around, I really want to get a first, because that proves to me that I've achieved. That came through particularly strongly with those that hadn't done as well as expected at A level, where, you know, they thought they were going to the red brick up the road, but they, on the day they had a really bad exam, didn't do so well in their A levels, were kind of really disappointed, and getting that first really meant something to them. But then there were other students who talked far more around, you know, I had one student who I think talks around, it didn't matter to her what the grade was. What she realised, it was about doing group presentations or individual presentations. And she talked around, she just thought, look, it doesn't matter what grade I get, I'm learning how to talk in public, I'm learning how to do a presentation. And it was the achievement of doing that that meant something to her, and that the grade didn't matter. So there was a bit of both. So there was a bit around getting those grades and feeling the satisfaction of that, but there was also just the satisfaction of learning how to do something, or learning what something meant.
Well, thanks. Joanne.
Thank you. Hello. I've
Hi.
such enjoyed listening to you today, and felt so validated, which I have to be careful, because I always, you know, you enjoy hearing people who think like you, don't you? And I don't want this to be about what I think, but I'm a learning developer. I'd be so interested in what you think the implications of this are for us, and how we talk to students about what it is we expect of them. Because I think I heard in your talk, but at least hints at it's sort of our fault to a certain extent that students become the students are disappointed. That we're sort of we're all implicated in this.
Yeah, I think partly we are all implicated in it, yeah. And I think one of the things that I focus on perhaps a bit more in my thesis is kind of certain aspects of things. So reading to me was a thing that really got me thinking, you know, if these students are struggling with how they should read, what they should read, that they should read at all. Yes, so some of them were just, reading's problematic to me, full stop, just reading in general. But that got me thinking about, well, we just presume they are going to read, but we presume they're going to read sometimes quite heavy textbooks, quite heavy journal articles, and we wrap things up, and we do this on a disciplinary basis. So I think that's why the discipline is quite important. The subject area is quite important, because each subject area has its own way of codifying its knowledge and talking about its knowledge. And I think, you know, the learn to learn is, to me, it's not learning to learn, it's learning to learn in a particular setting, and it's learning what's expected in terms of writing style. And even for me, coming from a kind of teaching in business studies, we very much tell students you can't write in the first person. It always has to be very objective, it has to be very rational. So kind of my personal example of that is coming from teaching in that kind of way to then coming and doing educational research and being asked, where's your voice? Why aren't you writing in the first person? Where's your, you know, where's what you think about it coming through? And that was a big switch for me. But then if you think that's how students, these kind of young adults, are needing to try and switch in terms of what they do, then it is in loads of ways. They're questions for us. That's around how we make knowledge accessible and how we expect them to interact with it. You know, how can we ask them to be critical thinkers but not talk about their opinion? Yes, and that's where it's down to us, I think, to question how we codify our knowledge and how we make that accessible. And that's things like referencing and all that kind of thing then come into question there.
And the moral undertone that I think we often attach to this, and I find sometimes in tutorials I make this mime, and I'm kind of doing, you know, are you an angel with a halo on? and maybe you need to drop the halo, and maybe where's your devil horns, because that you know, that's your own path, and you know, all of these metaphors that you've used that wonderful. Thank you, Gwenda. I've really enjoyed listening to you.
Thank you.
Thank you for letting me ask my question.
Thanks, Joanne. Sunil.
Yeah, thanks, Carolyn. Fascinating, Gwenda. Really great research and presentation. I'm a senior lecturer in the business school, so I suppose I'm your target audience in that respect. I've got one comment, observation really, and a question. But in terms of the first comment, the observation really is that, well, I come from the particularly dark side in management science.
Okay.
So my comments are kind of reflect what I experience in that particular area, and generally in the business school, but not about FAS or FAS as in social science or any other faculty or discipline. Although my PhD is in educational research, that's why I'm here. I suppose the first thing which I do want to say is, notwithstanding whatever you say, whatever the research says, whatever we read about engagement and attendance and so on, if you've got 400 students in a module whom you're going to lecture, and you go into one of the biggest lecture theatres on campus, Margaret Fell Lecture Theatre, and you find 40 students there. And I think whatever arguments might be there in terms of, you know, how students learn and engage and so on, for me personally, it's deflating, it's demotivating. I just think, why the hell I'm here? You know, if just 10% of my students are turning up in this fantastic new lecture theatre which the university has set up. But that's just one observation. I know the last few years I've really started questioning what we do in business schools anyway. Is this higher education? Do we really think that we are talking about higher education, or as I think it was J.B. Morris who said about a process, or is it that we are going through a process where we are imparting skills, training perhaps to students to be successful in the workplace? And that's not the idea of higher education which I have in mind. I mean, successive governments have kind of pushed on more and more participation in higher education. That's been going on not just in the UK, but in India and everywhere else. But not everyone has to go to a university, because a university and higher education means something different, for me at least. And it's coming at the cost of that technical education that, governments are trying to introduce T levels and all that sort of stuff again and again, keeps going around in circles. And you find there is higher education means something different. And I certainly think business schools need to kind of think about, is it higher education we are doing here, or is there some kind of skills and training? So I would be very interested to hear what your views on that are.
Yeah, I completely get what you're saying around you've got 400 students and you get 40 turn up. I mean, attendance is a massive, massive issue. I suppose one of the things that I'm saying, and it's not the cure for everything by any means whatsoever, but some of the language we use around independent learning and what's on our websites, what's on our study, that you only need to be in here for this amount of time, the rest of it you're on your own, actually pushes students away, and dropping that kind of focus on the independent side of things and talking about community, talking about engagement in a different way may actually pull a few more students in. And I think the other thing around, certainly the increase in student numbers. I mean, certainly there has been a huge increase in student numbers. I think my argument there would be not rather, why some of those students are at university. It's perhaps the underfunding of university in terms of provision for those students. You can't get to know a cohort of 400 students, so you can't work with them in the same way. But that's about staff-student ratios rather than the number of students being the issue. It's the number of staff that's the issue. It's having those kind of, if you have smaller classes, you get to know those students better, and I think that's one of my issues with metrics, that seeing students on dashboards in terms of numbers, that doesn't mean you know your students. Those kind of dashboards that you get for students does not replace knowing your students. It's a different kind of perspective on it. I don't know whether that answers all your questions, but I completely get that. I completely get how it feels to walk into a lecture theatre and expect, 100 students and get 20.
Thanks, Gwenda. So there were a couple of comments earlier on about the notion of independent learning and the term. So maybe we could pick up on those. So Richard Budd said how interesting your talk was, and there seems to be a distinction between independent in terms of lone study and independent in terms of independent of staff, or not as heavily dependent on educators. And then Cassie Chandler, I think, partly responding to that. Do we need a different term? It's hard to convince students that independent learning does not involve working with others and being ready to access support and ask questions. And I think we had a conversation, Gwenda, didn't we? When you were doing your work around some students asking whether it was legitimate to work with others in the library and so on.
Yeah.
I'm worrying about that. So I guess there's a kind of cluster of questions there. Or comments.
Yeah, I'm just reading them here. Yeah, I think that distinction between independent and dependence is an interesting one, because dependence on what? I think some of these questions, there's a paper by Morgan, which was from 1985, which was around questioning independent learning, and it was in relation to the Open University and kind of distance learning and that kind of thing. But one of the comments he makes is, who and how have we decided that independent learning is of greater value than dependent learning? And dependent and independent on what? Where's the proof that dependent learning's bad for you? Where's the proof that, working with a lecturer or a teacher in more detail or in different ways is wrong? Why the focus on independence and independence? where's the proof for it? Yeah, that one's better than the other. It just seems to be something that's become so ubiquitous that we just don't question it or question the value. And certainly, you know, in terms of dependent, I'm not talking about students being told how to think or told what the answers are. And certainly that's not what came through when I was talking to my participants. They didn't want that. They wanted to be challenged. They wanted to think differently. They wanted to be, couldn't term it critical thinking. They didn't know what that was, but that's what they were talking about when they were talking about interacting with knowledge, or you know, one of them said something about that he really enjoyed being questioned on his viewpoints and his morals, that he liked having those debates. Yes, do we need a different term? Yes, I think we could just call it learning. We could just call it learning at university. Yeah, we could just drop the kind of independent bit. I don't know whether that answers those questions.
I think it does. Yeah. Anne-Marie.
Yes, thanks, Gwenda. It's obviously really good to hear a bit more detail than we normally get. You talked at the beginning about the fact that there isn't a particular definition for independent learning, and you also referenced the two of the other popular terms of self-directed learning.
Yeah.
And also in terms of autonomous learning. And I know when I was engaged in my own PhD a few years ago, I was quite interested in the whole notion of autonomous learning. And I wondered what, you know, having thought about those three terms, why you had ultimately landed perhaps on independent, although I definitely recognise your point about learning. That's what it is. But what sort of helped you to decide independent rather than self-directed and or autonomous? Because I think they all have something in a way.
Yeah, they do. I think it's perhaps that when we talk to students about this across the sector, it's usually independent learning that we use as the term. That's usually what comes through in study skills guides or on university websites, rather than the autonomous or the self-directed. So I think that's perhaps why I focused on it.
Because yeah, that's interesting, because I can recall thinking, I used to think autonomous learning was very much on your own, but actually in reading and following up in terms of what it is, actually it is exactly as you have identified, that learning with others, knowing when to ask, when to engage, when to work on your and so I really became quite in favour of that notion of autonomous learning at the time. I mean, I haven't done much work with it since, but it's perhaps just worth revisiting, I think, and I can share with you when we can.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
Okay, we've still got a little bit of time if people have got more questions. I see a really long comment coming from Alison Montague. Alison, do you want to speak to that, or you don't have to? No pressure for you to, but
yeah, I can do. I think, can you see me? Oh yeah, hi. I am absolutely of the opinion that learning of any kind can only take place if the relationship between the person who is responsible for facilitating that learning is a partnership that's taken seriously. I might have hurried a bit through that, what I put in the chat, but I kind of needed to put that to be clear of what it is that I'm trying to say now. I think I'd also like to, I mean, in addition to what I've written there, which is a lot to do with about the constraints that we sometimes feel here in our institution, I absolutely, as we approach the end of this current academic year, I feel that I am split into two as a professional. I feel as if and I'm not even complaining, right? Maybe that's the point that I want to make. I don't complain about this anymore, not even to myself, because I have learned to accept it. And I don't even practice mindfulness, seriously. I think it's to do with perhaps that I'm at the end of my career now, I'm not at the beginning, which is another point that I think is really important in everything that we do. I've got tons of post-it notes here and I don't quite know where to start. When I talk about being split into two, what I mean is the institution. In higher education, I'm sure that this applies everywhere. And it's probably worse in schools. I can't imagine what it must be like in secondary schools. All of us are here because we like to be in the learning environment and we like to teach. That's why I came into this, because I decided that I could become good at it. And I still think that I can be good at it. But it's only because I detach myself from the institutional expectations that gave me a job in the first place, which is why I kind of also know which side my bread is buttered. But there's the other side of me that where I feel that as long as there aren't cameras in the classrooms and there aren't microphones picking up everything that I say, and I've been known to go looking before now, because we live in such a kind of under surveillance kind of existence now, but I don't actually, as soon as they put those beacons in for the attendance monitoring, I immediately panicked because I thought, what are they actually recording here? But I think it's only when I feel when I'm in the classroom and I don't have to fill in boxes and go to courses on what I'm supposed to do and strategy this and strategy that, that's when I feel like I can really do what I think I'm good at and I know the students like. But it is totally at loggerheads with the officialdom and the bureaucracy and that, because that would suggest that there are definite ways of doing things, which absolutely ties into what you've been talking about, Gwen, to do with independent learning. We're using that phrase over and over again, but we don't really know what it means. So it's absolutely fascinating what you're doing. And I like Jan, think that this should be published. And I think that more things should be done to sort of reach across different, not just departments and faculties, but different institutions, because, there is a lot of kids paying a lot of money to go to university now. And I'm still not convinced they really know what sent them there in the first place. The other thing that I really want to talk about is, it'll only take a minute. That's the size of my post-it. I've always been a keen advocate. I can't remember the word. I've always supported the idea that if you know your students, even just a little bit, it helps. Okay. But I also think it's important that they know us a little bit too. I also think it's important that as we progress through our careers, and some of us came here, on an hourly paid contract, we didn't think we were going to make careers out of it. So we never really had a chance to feel that we were on a journey and that journey was going to take us somewhere. I've never really understood the concept of tenure, because I just ended up, I'm a hanger-on, if you like, but I look back now, I've had 25 years in this place. Would I have done things differently if I'd have known I was going to be here that long? But what I do know is that as a person, as a human being, as somebody who shares a lot of my time, I spend more time with other people's children than I do with my own, so that's massively important, surely. But what I also realise is that in the 25 years that I've been here, the way that I see a student is different now. It must be, but I've had no way of monitoring it. The way that I related to students when I started, I wasn't that much older than some of them. I felt on their page. It was a completely different setup. They weren't paying the same fees that they're paying now. But there's been other life-changing things that have affected me and what I do in my career, which must overspill into the classroom, such as becoming a parent, getting married, having responsibilities, paying mortgages, being a bill payer. All of those things must surely impact on the relationship that we have with our students, and it must change. We never really have an opportunity to reflect on the importance of that and what part that plays in the partnership that I think you've been at pains to sort of get across at some point in your talk, Gwen. If I've made any sense, maybe, thanks for listening. That's all I can say. It's just your talk provoked quite a lot of thoughts. Yeah.
I think one of the things you said there, Alison, is about feeling that pull between what you think you should be doing and what the institution kind of says you should be doing. I think one of the things that I've kind of increasingly thought about is being clear that we kind of almost follow a student's agenda rather than push our agendas on them. And I think employability is a kind of prime case for that one, that at the moment universities are so focused on those graduate outcomes that employability comes a massive thing. But I think when you work with students, that employability, those kind of, that job isn't there at the forefront of why they went to university. And some of them won't know why they went, they just went. And others, you know.
Can I disagree with that, please? In a really polite way.
Of course you can.
I've got some evidence here that I gained from I'm so sorry, I wasn't interrupting, but I think it's opportune that I say this. I went to a conference in Derby a few years ago about student experience. And what I took away from that more than anything during the 2 days of sessions and things, I think, Anne-Marie, you were at that session, you were at that conference. They had a panel they had a kind of cross-section they represented a cross-section of the student body. So they went from undergraduates right through to postgraduates. And they had a panel, they were sitting on the stage, they were taking questions from us lot, you know. And what I took away, and I didn't even need to write it down because it hit me so hard, that today, might have changed, but back then, it was a few years ago, so I think it's still pretty relevant to today. But they'd done some research, they were all of the opinion, they'd done some kind of unofficial research amongst themselves and discovered that the reason that a student goes to university today is there are four criteria that they want to be able to accomplish. The first is the academic qualification, obviously the degree, extracurricular activity that goes beyond the classroom, graduate preparation, which is links to what you were just talking about then, and the other was to do with just social development, social skills, personal development, interacting with other people in ways that they've never done before. And it was all in equal measure. So each of those four criteria were of equal importance to each other. So I think that, I don't know how we measure this, or I feel personally that with the students that I relate to and have done over the last couple of years, especially, they are heavily invested in their careers. And I think that's perhaps one of the things that I do, you know, if I was a student paying what they're paying, I'm kind of going to want there to be, I would almost expect there to be an element of graduate preparation in whatever I was doing at university. Yeah, that's it. I won't interrupt again, but I hope maybe you can talk about that, please.
I mean, any young person, unless they come from a very economically privileged background, any young person is going to consider what their future is in terms of employment and in terms of jobs. So absolutely, I think, you know, it is an issue and it is something that they are considering and that they are thinking about. I don't necessarily think it's there at the top of their agenda. You know, I teach employability modules. And I always start off with, look, you may not have a clue what you want. You may not have that career plan. I know that you will be thinking about jobs at some point, but I want to follow your agenda in terms of that rather than the university agenda, which is you're going to graduate with a really good degree and you're going to go on and immediately get a graduate level job. Because I just don't think, I mean, maybe this is just my sense from working with those students and teaching with those students that they know those things are important, but it just isn't there at the top of their list. That they want to enjoy their learning, they want to enjoy their time at university. They don't want the constant stress of what are you doing to increase your employment opportunities.
Brilliant, thank you. So we're running short of time, and I think, Gwenda, the fact that we've had such a full and lively discussion kind of shows how interesting your work is and what a valuable session this has been and how much people have enjoyed it, I think. So thank you so much for that. Just before we finish, I want to say two things. One is, if anybody's not on the mailing list for these seminars and wants to be, then just email Dee, who you contacted to get into this seminar. So Dee will put you on the mailing list if you'd like to be on it. Secondly, the next seminar is on Wednesday, the 15th of May, and will be presented by Don Passy, who's a professor in the department here. And the title is Parents, Education and Digital Technology. So that's on the 15th of May. But again, thank you so much, Gwenda. That was such an interesting session. And as I say, we easily had 45 minutes of questions and discussion around how interesting it was and what a great presentation it was. So thank you very much. And lots, I think you'll, Dee, am I right in saying you'll send the chat to Gwenda?
Yes, I will, yeah.
Brilliant, thanks. So you could have a look at positive comments at your leisure. And also some comments about the notion of independent learning in there. And also lots of requests that you publish it. So there you go.
That's my summer task then. Get my marking done first.
And thanks so much everybody for attending.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for all the questions, everyone. Thanks a lot.
Thanks. Bye, everybody.